The Cold War was a period of tension and hostility between the United States and the USSR. And occasionally during this period, the tension developed into a real threat of actual war, and in some cases, actual nuclear war. One of these times, probably the scariest time, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And if you remember, Cuba is an island very close to the United States, very close to Florida. And if you also remember from the arms race, our nuclear capabilities eventually develop into the ability to launch missiles into space. The United States gets this ability first, before the Soviet Union. They are the first to go into space with Sputnik, but we kind of leapfrog back and forth. And by the early 60s, the US has long-range missiles, and the Soviet Union doesn't quite have long-range missiles. And so the Cuban Missile Crisis centered around the Soviet Union putting a nuclear military base in Cuba so that it could strike the United States, which is something that missiles that were in the Soviet Union couldn't yet do. All right, but first you need some of the backstory. 1959, there's a revolution in Cuba, and Fidel Castro emerges as the leader. The United States is initially very pleased with Castro. We see him as a hero and somebody that's going to be a positive influence and a friend to the United States. However, a year later, Cuba becomes communist, and the U.S., because of the proximity between Cuba and the United States, feels very threatened by this. So 1961, the United States supports an attempt by Cuban exiles to assassinate Castro. And this assassination is a failure. You may have heard of the Bay of Pigs invasion. The assassins are immediately surrounded and captured, and even though it was not maybe something that the United States did in a very official capacity, everybody knew that these assassins had U.S. support. And so the level of tension between the United States and the now communist Cuba is very high. The following year, Castro allows the USSR to begin to build nuclear missile bases in Cuba, and here is where the crisis starts. U.S. President Kennedy demands that the Soviet Union remove these missile bases and threatens a United States invasion of Cuba, so an official, full-scale U.S. military invasion of Cuba. The crisis goes on for about 2 weeks, where there's demands back and forth, and there is a 1-week standoff, and the United States, blockades Cuba, and there's a U.S. plane that's shot down in the context of this. So it was really scary 2 weeks and a really scary week. And ultimately, the Soviet Union does back down. The demands fly back and forth. Kennedy demands that, obviously, the Soviet Union removes the missile bases. And in exchange, Khrushchev demands that the United States remove our military bases, or any plans that we had to develop military bases in Turkey. And he also demands that we, obviously, do not invade Cuba. Kennedy publicly agrees to not invade Cuba in exchange for the Soviet Union leaving. But secretly, he also agrees not to have military bases in Turkey. So both sides ultimately feel better. They feel that their enemy does not have bases in a neighboring country, and the crisis is avoided.